Okay, good morning, Year 13. We're going to look at Brave New World today, and as ever, because we're studying The Handmaid's Tale, we're going to link it to The Handmaid's Tale as much as possible. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is described as a satirical piece of fiction, not scientific prophecy. I'm actually going to question that and actually say that Huxley did intend it to be a piece of prophecy, just as I think Margaret Atwood potentially saw The Handmaid's Tale as a piece of dark prophecy as well. I've used this particular picture here because one of the things that we're going to be looking at in Brave New World is the idea of how we can actually transfix people, how we can use their unconscious minds, how we can bypass their rationality and control them through sensuality, the body, biochemistry, drugs, genetics, etc. In that sense, it departs from The Handmaid's Tale, doesn't it? Because The Handmaid's Tale, in its very visible manipulation of power, seems to be a little bit more coercive. However, we will see elements of Brave New World in it, okay? Now, to start off, okay? It serves as a symbol for the false promise of universal happiness. As I'll show you later, Huxley was very worried that people in corporate America in particular had found a way to kind of bypass enlightened self-interest, and they were able to manipulate people, as I say, almost on a kind of biochemical level. Huxley was very, very unimpressed with what we could call Fordism, the idea of mass production in America and the idea of a mass consumer goods. He would have hated to buy if he would have been here. If you took Huxley to a mall, he would have seen that as everything that he hates, basically. And he asked the question is, how can a future where everyone is happy become a dystopia? And that is a big question. Of course, though, in terms of literature, we could look back to something like the Odyssey, where Odysseus and his sailors go to the island of the nymph Calypso, and they all eat the lotus flowers. Have any of you read that before? And of course, they're all happy because they forget everything. But we mustn't forget that they're drugged. So this becomes the question. Can a society that makes people happy be coercive? And I think Huxley says that it can. Now, Huxley is using a lot of Pavlovian-style conditioning. He's looking at the emerging field of behaviorism and psychology, and he's also very troubled by eugenics, which is the idea that you can actually manipulate chromosomes and genes to have kind of designer human beings and designer babies. Now, you may feel as though that seems a bit alarmist, but there were many political theorists who were very excited by the idea of controlling, cloning, etc., etc. He's also very interested in the idea of using mass-produced goods and soma, which is a kind of Prozac-like psychic tranquilizer, as I say here, as well as the films. And he foresaw 4D films. He refers to them as the feelies, where literally you'd be stroked, etc. So in a sense, what makes this book so visionary would be that it kind of prophesizes the kind of things we see today, like sex robots, etc., where you could use technology to actually manipulate people on a sensual level. Brave New World is a dictatorship, but of course it is a benevolent dictatorship, okay? It is a totalitarian welfare state. So to some people, of course, it would be a utopia, wouldn't it? And this is what I started the course off telling you, that one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. Maybe in that quest for perfection, we end up with a kind of nightmarish, coercive conformism in which the individual seems to die entirely. Now, Huxley says that in 1931, when Brave New World was being written, I was convinced that there was still plenty of time. The completely organized society, the scientific caste system, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness, the orthodoxies drummed in by nightly courses of sleep teaching. These things were coming all right, but not in my time. Now, one of the key things about Brave New World is he revisits it in 1958. And this is what he says, guys. I feel a good deal less optimistic than I did when I was writing Brave New World. The prophecies made in 1931 are coming true much sooner than I thought they would. It would almost be like Margaret Atwood rewrote The Handmaid's Tale now and said to us, oh my God, I meant this as a cautionary tale, and look, my predictions have been fulfilled. So Huxley actually felt that many of his predictions had come into being. This is a key element of The Handmaid's Tale, the whole idea of hierarchy, as you know. We have the betas, the alphas, the alpha pluses, the gammas, the deltas, the epsilons, okay? And these people are genetically created. They're genetically created, partly through manipulation of the actual chromosomes, as I said, but also through a kind of regime of drugging, which we'll go into a bit more in a moment. Again, we don't have time to look at these two clips. I strongly recommend that you have a look at them and watch them. They'll really help your understanding of the novel. Now, we've looked at 1984 already, have we not? Okay. And we know that in George Orwell's 1984, there's a kind of idea of Stalinism. There are elements of Nazism as well, okay? It's a brutal dictatorship. It's based on punishment and terror. Now, in the imaginary world of Huxley's fable, punishment is infrequent and generally mild. That said, there is punishment of babies. And I think when I was about your age, I remember reading this scene and just thinking it was one of the greatest scenes that I'd read in literature, where I think I told you before, the babies who are going to be gammas are conditioned. They're shown books and they're shown flowers. They crawl towards them and then they're electrocuted over and over again and conditioned to hate those objects. So there is an element of social conditioning at a young age, but it's so successful. And in some ways, I think this is bleaker than 1984 because it suggests that if you get people young and through a combination of social conditioning and genetics, you could make it so that they have no interest in things like art or the news or self-reflection, etc. In Brave New World, it is non-violent manipulation, as you know. And what is entirely different from 1984 is rather than having an anti-sex league, like we have in 1984, in Brave New World, you are almost coerced into being promiscuous. So you're told to have loads and loads of sex, and drugged up sex as well. I think Huxley felt that dictatorship would be achieved not through the denial of sensuality, but rather by the complete manipulation of it. And I think in the world of Tinder, etc., that we live in now, I think that that's shown to be more correct, isn't it? I think the more kind of coercive method has failed. You'd associate that with, say, the Soviet Union, the East Bloc, which has failed. And what you could argue is in kind of neoliberal corporate capitalism, there's definitely an attempt, isn't there, to control people through their bodies and through their appetites. Okay. Huxley says, in the brave new world of my fantasy, eugenics and dysgenics were practiced systematically. By dysgenics, he means the kind of disintegration and destruction of the embryos, deliberately damaging them, affecting people's intelligence, etc., creating a kind of workforce of idiots, of automatons, yeah? Brave New World presents a fanciful and somewhat ribald picture of society, okay? And by ribald here, we mean almost jokey. In some ways, they're termites. In other ways, they'd be more recognizable to some of the films we see today. If you go and watch a wonderful film like Romero, Night of the Living Dead, he has a scene where the zombies break into a mall and walk around the mall, and they're looking in the shops. And he montages it with images of real people just looking in the mall and at the windows of shops. And he's making a political point, isn't he? That we become mindless consumers. We are zombie-like in many ways. A lot of that kind of criticism, I think, could be traced to Huxley's idea of society. Again, I've got a wonderful little film over here. I recommend that you watch this clip at home. There's an interview with Huxley in it. So what did Huxley see as the kind of racial species hierarchy in Brave New World? The alphas, these are the controllers. They would be bigger, stronger, and cleverer. They are like the jocks at Ivy League, basically, okay? The betas would be your kind of middle managers, and they would have certain kind of characteristics, but not too much ambition. The gammas would be your normal workers, your office workers, your clerks, etc., people who would efficiently do routine tasks. Down to the deltas, well, again, this would be the people who really perform kind of manual work, etc. And the epsilons would be the kind of the sewage workers, etc., the people who cleaned up radioactive waste, etc. The people where you wanted no thought and no reflection whatsoever. How does this relate to The Handmaid's Tale? Well, I think you'll all see that Margaret Atwood has definitely used the idea of hierarchy. It's quite surprising, isn't it? Because Atwood is looking at one element of America, the Puritan inheritance, and emphasizing how dark that is. But she's denying the better side of America, which is this idea of the land of opportunity. We can see The Handmaid's Tale has no opportunity, does it? It's actually as rigidly hierarchical as The Brave New World. We have commanders, don't we? We have the wives. And then we have people like Nick, etc. And we have the angels, who are basically kind of suicide warriors, aren't they? And you'll notice with the women, for instance, you have econo-wives, don't you? Now, it seems to me that Margaret Atwood there is definitely drawing off the Brave New World model and showing this kind of rigid hierarchy, which is quite interesting. Again, because in this talk we don't have time to watch these videos, I would love you to look through them. The first one is on Nazi eugenics. The second one is on eugenics itself. And the third one is on the lobotomy. And this is something that I think a few of you would be really interested in. The lobotomy was being used in the 1930s and 1940s up until the 1950s. And I'm sure that Sophia would know this, that they were so proud of the fact that in the end they could carry out a lobotomy in less than 5 minutes by driving a stake in through your eye and damaging the front part of your brain. So they could intellectually impair you. Now, this was used predominantly at the time for hysterical women, okay, maybe women who are just unhappy with their lives. But I think that some people were very interested in the potential to use this kind of technology to produce a kind of race of mindless workers. And in the darker, more right-wing circles, maybe this was seen as a kind of possibility. So Huxley was very, very concerned about this. The idea that we would create a species in which there was no possibility of improvement, etc. And again, I think that Handmaid's Tale has elements of that, does it not? Mike Wallace, in this particular interview, interviews Aldous Huxley. I strongly recommend that you watch it again. Huxley will be reflecting on his 1931 vision of society and talking about what really upsets him. Now, in terms of the historical context, I apologize because this is rather a dense slide, okay? I want to point out this particular element of the slide, okay? It's well documented that in particular, Huxley was very, very worried by ideas of mass production. And he was extremely anti-American. When he visited America, he saw a vision of prosperity. But he actually really disapproved of the kind of bubblegum society that he found. He disapproved of the notion of a kind of leisure society that was orientated towards hedonism. So I want you to see that he combined this critique of the United States with a critique of the post-Russian Revolution, USSR. In that particular idea, there was this notion that the individual should be subordinated to the state, wasn't there? And this notion of the people, which is an idea of a kind of abstract collective. And this is what absolutely terrifies him. I think he took many of his ideas, as you know, from Zamyatin's Russian novel We, where you had the United State. In Brave New World, we have the world state. In both cases, the collective abstraction is so much more powerful than the individual, and that self-realization then is presented as dysfunctional, as greedy and selfish. Some of the things that really worried Huxley was his trips to ICI, that's the Imperial Chemical Industries, which is still a large company in Britain now, where he saw this huge-scale industrialization. And he was also very worried by the H.G. Wells idea. H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine and other books, but in particular, he hated H.G. Wells' book, Men Like Gods, which was a kind of utopian science fiction where technology would be utilized to make this kind of nirvana, this paradise, yeah? In fact, as I said, Huxley referred to Brave New World as a negative utopia. So you could see Brave New World as a rewriting of H.G. Wells' notion of a technological inspired utopia. And if we think in terms of The Handmaid's Tale, technology is generally presented as negative, isn't it? The CompuCheck, do you remember the banking system is what allows Gilead to take over people's money with such ease, okay? If we think about the Soul Scrolls, they seem to represent a kind of mechanical, anti-spiritual, soulless idea of religion. So I think in general, Margaret Atwood would be working off the more negative idea of technology there, and hence that would align with Brave New World. I would say that it's fair to say that one of Huxley's great hate figures was Henry Ford. And Henry Ford's idea of a kind of world in which every man and woman were bought with a motor car, and that it was a world of mass production where things like artistic expression, religion, what we could call the noumenal world, the invisible, intangible world, was replaced with a kind of consumer world in which people were bought. And of course, there were some very dark things about Henry Ford. He was a very, very much anti-Semitic, a hater of the Jews, and Huxley felt there were very right-wing corporate elements to his kind of notion of society that were incredibly dangerous. The kind of thing that we would see today in what's Harrison Ford's Blade Runner, where corporations have simply taken over. So do you remember we talked about dystopias and the corporate dystopia? In Brave New World, we definitely have a kind of corporate dystopia. Here we see the Model T assembly line, and this is brilliantly shown in Charlie Chaplin's film Modern Times. If you ever want to watch a wonderful film of how more liberal people were feeling in the late 1920s, early 1930s, watch Charlie Chaplin Modern Times, where he really parodies and satirizes this idea that we will get happiness through these consumer goods. As I said, he exploits also fears about communism. And what he's saying that's really interesting is that the price of universal happiness will be things like motherhood, home, family, freedom, and love. Very much the message, I think, of Brave New World, very much of The Handmaid's Tale, don't you think? This notion of the private self being deconstructed and dismantled. And he's asking, even if people are happy, even if slaves kiss their chains, are they not still slaves? In our passage that we'll look at in a moment, we will see that Mustafa Mond is one of the main protagonists of Brave New World. He's the resident controller of Western Europe, and it's like the governor of Western Europe is a genetic scientist. So the elements here are Frankenstein, aren't there? The idea that the controller of the future will be the controller of our genes. We don't see that in The Handmaid's Tale so much, do we? But we do see the hatred of the shredder. Do you remember that? The unbaby. and this notion that we will simply slaughter anyone who doesn't actually, coordinate with the kind of genetic society that we're looking for. There are only 10,000 surnames in Brave New World. Citizens must not fall in love, marry, or have their own children. It is a world of test tubes. It's a world, as we'll see in our passage, in which people don't conceive in the white heat of passion. They conceive in test tubes. And Huxley saw something absolutely nightmarish in that vision. This is where Huxley talks about advertising. One of the main things that terrified him was advertising, and Huxley understood that advertising worked on a subliminal level. And this is what he talks about. Why advertising was so important to him is he saw that advertising would go beneath the idea of rational choice, and that it would bypass the rational side of humanity, and it would appeal to what he called unconscious forces. And so I think Huxley was working very much within the tradition of enlightenment, which prizes reason and the idea that your choices are made through deductive reasoning or through inductive reasoning, the idea that you'd thought carefully rather than just acting out on emotion, pleasure, etc. And I want you to think all the time about this idea of a world in which we are controlled and manipulated through images, in which we bypass our rationality. Huxley, as we know, helped to define a new kind of genre. I think that you will not see perhaps quite as many influences in The Handmaid's Tale as you do from 1984, but I want you to see that they're very important AO4 elements to this as well. Thank you.